Chapter 3. On the next installment of his program, Nightingale downplayed suggestions that the criminal had evidently been a fan of his. He responded to the claim by dryly observing that some reports had mentioned the catcher in the rye in the man's possession, but no one was blaming Salinger for anything. "What this program has always been about, very simply, is freedom," said Nightingale. "Freedom of speech, freedom to air views that may be unpopular or that make people uncomfortable. Because that is what this country is about, and it's what the First Amendment is about. Now, it may be upsetting sometimes to those guys in government, Democrats, Republicans, whoever, that I say some of the things I do. But what we have always cared about is the truth, and I'm never going to change that. But I've also never advocated violence against anyone. And if this guy, this terrorist and his buddies were listening to me and my callers, then I don't know where they got their ideas, but it was not from me." This business concluded, he proceeded to the main portion of the program, which was to interview a man called Dr. Godfrey Herrendorf concerning his ideas that signs embedded in Egyptian hieroglyphics and other ancient writings have, so Herrendorf said, foretold some of the events occurring in the modern world. The program was always monitored by the NSA, in case Nightingale said anything too far out of line, or anything that could be silenced under the heading of yelling fire in a crowded theater. Nightingale himself would often say that it is not wrong to yell fire in a theater if there really is a fire. In any case, the subjects discussed on his program were often so incredible that there was no need to fear they would gain wide acceptance. He was, at this time, in short, a general annoyance rather than a true threat. What occupied the government's attention mainly was the increase in domestic terrorist activities, of which Gallaghan had been symptomatic. But all over the country, especially in the rural parts where the open spaces held farms and ranches distant from the centers of power in Washington, D.C., and New York City and New Los Angeles, there were people who rebelled against the federal authority. Some did it by refusing to pay taxes to a government they believed no longer represented them, and some went still further, planning, as Gallaghan had, to eliminate those whom they considered to be traitorous officials who had taken over the government. It was to one such hotbed of anti-government feeling, the impoverished state of West Virginia, that agents Maynard and Brett had been sent some months after the conclusion of the Gallaghan affair, to investigate the operations of another cell of rebels. There was something in the quiet, winding roads that they followed through the hills that gave them a vague sense of foreboding. Perhaps it was simply the foreignness of the rustic landscape and culture. As they drove towards Point Pleasant, where they were to meet their contact, they saw many a truck and building in the sleepy mountains adorned with the flag of the old Confederacy. It was ironic, given the state's history, that so many there now felt sympathy with the bygone rebellion. But then symbols can take a life of their own, and the meanings they communicate may vary depending on the predilections of the beholder. In that way, symbols are the ultimate politicians. At Point Pleasant, Agent Maynard parked the van and went to the location designated to meet the plainclothes agent who had for some time been under cover among a group of anti-government radicals like Gallaghan. She soon saw him standing in a long brown coat and khakis beside a strange-looking silver statue. Approaching him, she uttered the password. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. And he replied with the proper response, "Would it not be easier in that case for the government to dissolve the people and elect another?" This catechism complete, she turned with a nod towards the queer statue. It was a silver, shiny humanoid figure with large wings spread behind it. It was all at once bird-like, insectoid, and humanoid. Its ruby eyes glowed in the sunlight, and the strange patterns that glinted inside them seemed to evoke some distant realm of cosmic mystery. "What the hell is this?" she asked. "It is the Mothman," he answered with a shrug. She raised an eyebrow quizzically. "A creature said to have come from another planet, or perhaps summoned by some Indian curse. They used to see it around here. Whatever it is, superstition says it caused the collapse of the Silver Bridge in the 60s. I say, if it really was anything, and not some crap that some drunken idiots imagined, it was most likely somebody who was trying out an experimental flight suit over at McClintock. Some folks say it still comes down from the hills and attacks the local farm animals. Been a big to-do about that lately, actually. Animals have been getting slaughtered in the night, and nobody can say by what. But I'm guessing that isn't why you're here, Maynard. The problems of a few poor miners turned subsistence farmers aren't the sort of thing the company cares about. Not unless it might threaten the people pulling the strings up at the top. He took a long drag on his cigar. Careful there, Scott, she said. How long have you been planted with these neo-Nazi types? Haven't gone native, have you? No, ma'am, he said quietly. Stayed native. Can you say the same? There was a tense silence, during which Agent Maynard's hand moved imperceptibly towards her holstered Sig Sauer. She was glad to know that Brett was covering her from the van. She only hoped that if Scott went for the weapon undoubtedly concealed in his coat, Brett would realize what was happening quickly enough. But Scott broke the silence, saying, I haven't turned traitor, if that's what you're worried about. But you try staying out here in these hills, hanging around with a bunch of Joes who are trying to get by since the job's dried up, listening to 'em talk about how bad it is, and you just try and keep believing that the guys at the top know what they're doing. Look, she said, do you have information on the militia groups operating in this area? Oh, sure, he answered. I've been rising through the ranks in 'em for years. Come on, I'll take you back to my place, and we can go over it. There's my truck. He gestured towards a beat-up Ford pickup. Just follow me. Roger that, she said, and returned to the van where Brett was waiting. They followed the old pickup out of Point Pleasant and deeper into the hilly regions of the state, through winding mountain paths darkened by thick green vegetation. The afternoon had been clear, but now ominous storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, casting another shade upon the uneasy peacefulness of the countryside. They arrived in the early evening at Scott's remote house, tucked away high in the hills on an unpaved road. On exiting the van, Maynard and Brett were confronted by two barking German shepherds chained to the trees outside the small ranch. Ignore General Fairfax and Colonel Pride there, said Scott with a smile. If I had a high-tech security system, it'd give me away, so I used them. Don't worry, just stay out of biting range and you'll be okay. Carefully avoiding the snarling canines, the two agents followed him inside the run-down shack. It was fairly Spartan inside, and the blinds were shut to keep it dark. In one corner of the living room was a large gun safe, and on the coffee table in front of the sofa were two books. One, a history of modern weaponry, and the other a biography of the 20th century Senator Barry Goldwater. Scott saw them glance at the books and shrugged. Keeping up appearances, he said simply. He led them into the kitchen, where he offered them both some beer, which they declined, reminding him about agency regulations. He smiled and poured himself a Heineken. He pulled out his tablet device and began a secure transfer of his files on the militia group to the mobile devices belonging to the other two agents. There's meeting notes, agendas, summaries of armaments, names, addresses, every recorded bit of information I've gotten on these guys during the last few years, he said, standing up from the table and beginning to pace the room. But I'll tell you, if you really want to get a sense of what these folks are about, you're going to have to do more than read that stuff. I mean, it all sounds like a bunch of crazy right-wing conspiracies when you just read it. There's a reason for that, I'll bet, said Maynard archly. Yeah, but... Scott paused, and he seemed to be struggling to find words to describe something nebulous. It's something that you can't get until you've been in these places and hung around with these people. I mean, none of it makes a lick of sense when it's written down, but then when you live out here, away from the elitists in the cities, and away from the bigwigs in the government. You start to, well, I won't say believe them exactly, but you start to feel like there's another dimension to everything, and we don't get it. He fell silent, and seemed for a moment to lose himself in his inner ruminations. Brett and Maynard glanced at each other, wordlessly exchanging their ever-increasing suspicion that Agent Scott was not quite reliably loyal to the government anymore. "Well, anyhow," Scott said, finally, taking a swig of Heineken, "you'll find out for yourselves, I guess, whether there's anything to it, or if I'm just some old mountain man who stayed up here a little too long. What exactly did the company send you here to do?" Maynard explained. "The priority target is to investigate to what extent these militia movements are connected with similar movements deeper in the South, rebel movements increasingly opposing the federal government. Our job is to investigate, and if necessary remove, any high-value targets." Scott smiled and said, "Well, I'm sure you'll find plenty of those amongst the folks here. They are not really on good terms with us federales, that's for sure. But we'll have time to talk more later on. For now, you can stay in the spare room." "Don't get your hopes up, son," he snapped at Brett. "There's 2 beds. Besides which, I'm dead tired. Goddamn dogs woke me up at 4 in the morning, so I want you to take first watch. Get me in 4 hours. Feel free to read over some of the stuff I gave you in the meantime." And with that, he retired to his bedroom. "This guy's off his rocker," Brett said to Maynard. "Must be something in the water, or maybe the solitude has gotten to his head, but he's violating every rule in the book." "I agree," she said, "but I don't think he's against us exactly. He's just nuts. So what do you want to do?" "Get whatever other human we can out of him, then phone home and explain he needs to be relieved for psych reasons. Tell them to make it bureau business and give us control of the situation. Then we'll start checking out his right-wing buddies." The slow-moving storm that had loomed over their drive to Scott's house had finally arrived, and in the flashing lightning and pouring rain, Brett could not see very much out of the front windows of the house. He equipped his thermal goggles to try to get a better view of what was transpiring outside. Through the dark and the thick sheets of rain, he could see the 2 animals huddled under the great sycamore tree. This was the trouble with guard dogs. They no doubt were too preoccupied with keeping dry to stay alert for true threats. Moreover, the scents welling up from the wet ground probably blocked their sense of smell. Even as Brett thought this, he saw the creatures stirring and moving, apparently looking towards the house. Then, just as suddenly, they crumbled to the ground. So suddenly, Brett suspected they had been shot. He yelled for Maynard to wake up, and at the same instant drew his sidearm. As she rushed out of the bedroom, he took up a position immediately next to the window. Then there was a tremendous flash of lightning, and a huge thunderclap shook the whole cabin. It seemed as if lightning must have struck very nearby, if not the building itself. As the roar died away, the 2 agents' ears registered another sound, that of an agonized scream from Scott's room. "Keep me covered!" Brett yelled, and Maynard drew her own pistol, taking up a position where she could see from the front door clear through the house to Scott's bedroom door at the rear. Brett advanced on it quickly, stopping next to it and listening for further noise within, but he could make out nothing, though it was hard to do so over the constant rumble of the storm. Then, with one motion, he kicked down the door and swept the room with his pistol, ready to gun down any intruder. But there was no intruder inside. Only an open window through which rain poured and the howling wind swept in and sent the lamp and other bedside items toppling over. And underneath this window was Agent Scott, lying in his bed, his eyes wide open in fear and his throat slit from ear to ear. His shirt was open, and on his chest was a gaping and horrific series of gashes.